All right, so here we go. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Inshallah, today we've got some homework to do. I'm really excited because I'm actually going to be covering some hadiths, two hadiths actually, that are very famous and very common. But I wanted to actually get to some of the things that first we had talked about yesterday. Yesterday, we pretty much spent most of the time talking about the hadith. Um, الأرواح جنود مجندة ما تعارف عليها ائتلف وما تناكر منها اختلف. We went into lots of details with that one. And another hadith that was narrated in Sahih Muslim, that people are like المعادن كالفضة والذهب. That people are just like different elements of, or different elements that we would find as basically silver and gold. And certainly when we're comparing human beings to whether we're speaking about elements or we're speaking about animals, we're talking about certain similarities to help us understand what human beings consist of, and understanding our qualities, understanding our behaviors, understanding the different things that can make up what it means to be human, what it means to be a person that we can research, we can understand, we can also put a certain milestone. What are we trying to get to? So certainly when we said al-arwahu junudun mujannada, to summarize it, we said, well, it's the soul's, your own soul, and to, say the preponderant explanation is that your own soul, the way that you would raise it, is basically what it will find compatibility in whatever it basically lived up to or lived down to. So what does that mean? If your soul, you raised it, you disciplined it to be a person of good, then you're going to be finding the people of good as the people you are compatible with, as the people that your heart basically finds compatibility, finds friendship with, finds an area of support and an area of similarity in, and and therefore, um, and therefore you will be needing to do certain responsibility in order to get to الأرواح جنود مجندة ما تعرف عليها ائتلف. This basically tells us the reality of every single soul. Mine, yours, every single one. ما تعارف عليها ائتلف. Whatever it is acquainted with, it basically finds compatibility in. You're acquainted with salah, you're acquainted with good talk, you're acquainted with masajid, you'll basically find yourself compatible with the people of the masajid and following these kind of people, subscribing to these kind of people's channels. And on the other hand, it also goes the other way. If the person is basically living of a person that basically did not do tazkiyah, قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا وَقَدْ خَابَ مَنْ دَسَّاهَا. The person that had grown their souls and their nafs into a nafs of khair, it will basically match with those that have khair in them. If it goes down to matching with those people that have shar in them or evil, it basically means you got to work on your nafs. So if you want to find that compatibility, you want to know where your heart is at, what does your heart like? That's one question. What does your heart like? Does your heart like salihin? Then you're one of the salihin. Does your heart like the fasidin and the people that are basically low and all of those? Then your heart is part of the fasidin. What if it does like the fasidin? But I really want to be part of the salihin. Surround yourself with the salihin. Select the salihin to be around you, and you will be amongst the salihin. Even if you are not one of the salihin, surround yourself with them, and your nafs will get corrected to be in the right place. That's the first thing. So this hadith is aiming at telling us how to be selective in the friendships that we choose, the people that we surround ourselves with, basically. And that's a word that we always, especially especially girls, I would say, sorry, ladies, but especially girls, when we're speaking about girls, especially, that it is part, and sometimes boys as well, part of sometimes their nature, that they're seeking social acceptance. People to just accept them socially, people to just endorse them. Why? Because they may not yet be capable of recognizing whether something is a good manner or a bad manner. In their early childhood, it was if mama basically said no or yes. That was in their early childhood. Once they grow a little bit older, that's when they see the society either endorsing or basically telling them that they're displeased with such a behavior. Once they are adults, and sometimes they don't grow to being adults, at least in their maturity. So in that situation, you would see girls from ages 10 to 14, or perhaps as well some boys as well, that sometimes when they see other people laughing at or giggling at their behavior, or probably maybe them becoming the jokers in class, or perhaps maybe the ones getting attention, they would interpret attention for endorsement, because they had not matured to understanding that in order to understand the khuluq, you either look at the consequence of what this is leading you, or a higher level of maturity is to understand whether Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will take you to Jannah for this manner, or whether Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will punish you as in hellfire for this manner. So that's another higher level of maturity, is when they understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allahu khaliqi, Allahu nadhirun ilay, Allah is my creator. He can see what I'm doing. Regardless of whether I get punished for it or not, I know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be the one to hold me accountable for this action. That's basically what it means. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be the one to hold me accountable for this action, and therefore to basically let them understand a higher level of maturity in defining akhlaq, in defining mannerisms, in defining basically what it means to be an adult, what it means to be mature. All right, let's see. إلا أن تكون ملكين. So we went in details. إلا أن تكون ملكين. The day before yesterday, and we said there are different قراءات for this one. إلا أن تكون ملكين, or ملكين, or ملكين. And we also talked about some of them. We said ملكين is basically to say two angels, and we also went in some details with that. Okay, so if Shaitan was telling them, well, you will be, or unless you would want to be malakain, to be angels, then in that situation, how do we understand this? How do we understand that Shaitan was telling them, hey, you'll be angels if you eat from the tree? Or what exactly does that look like? So what that looks like is that Shaitan was basically telling them that that's one interpretation, you'll basically be living eternally, because malaika basically do not die until Judgment Day. So was Shaitan giving them a narrative? This is a very important thing to consider, is that Shaitan and all the different bad people evil will basically come in a narrative, or well, let's use a different word, in an advertisement. In an advertisement, to make it seem like this will give you happiness, this will give you power, this will give you acceptance, this will make you basically appear of importance. This will put you at a level that will give you security, or whatever it is. And then that's how evil is basically marketed into. Evil is marketed into giving you promises. This is very important to keep in mind. If you were to summarize marketing, it's all about giving you promises. That's basically what it is. And part of the marketing study is studying the psychology of human beings and understanding what makes them basically find something attractive. So that's what Shaitan studied. Shaitan did basically, let's call it a psychology study on Adam to know what exactly he's aiming for, what exactly is his fears, what exactly is he hopeful for, and what does he want. So what did he give him? Well, he basically told him that shajarat al-khuld. Let's give it a new name. He called it shajarat al-khuld. It's the tree of eternity. Why? Because he recognized that one of the biggest fears for Adam is death. That's what Adam fears. Therefore, let me tell him that this tree right there is basically the tree that contains all of the things that he would wish for, which is certainly in this situation, he would wish for a long-lasting health that would ensure basically eternity and that he would never die, basically. That's what he promised him. So he studied his psychology. And that's the same thing if you were to study female psychology or male psychology, you would see every single stage and every single age. Of course, in the area of marketing, they'll basically, hey, if you use these nails, it'll basically look attractive. If you puff up your lips, the boys and the guys will think you're attractive. And if you puff up this area or you slim down this area, you cut off some of your ribs, you'll appear like this doll and whatever it is. And if you, I don't know, you make your hair look in this way, you will look like this. And of course, certainly it is part of studying female psychology or male psychology. Hey, do you want to look attractive? Pop up this area or enlarge that area or cut down on this area, or maybe you can get this money, get this car, get that money, get etc. All these different things, and then it becomes this marketing that shaitan uses human beings in order to attract them. And this is very important that Shaitan said, and I will order them to change the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I will order them to change the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a way to change what is within. Keep that one in mind. So in other words, Shaitan, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala quoted that he will use the marketing of changing your appearance, changing your creation, your nature as a tool, as a way, as a channel to changing your hearts, to changing your ruh. And this is extremely important to keep in mind. Extremely important. So what you see in the industry of cosmetics and the industry that basically right now of those surgeries and those Botox and fillings and whatever they call those, that basically is coming from mainly from Shaitan, unless it is used basically unless it is used for let's call it for health reasons, then that's a different story. But if it is used in order to pacify us away from fixing our hearts, and we're just working on just fitting in and getting that endorsement, getting that social acceptance, then this is definitely shaitani. This is definitely shaitani. Okay, so enough of that. So the first interpretation basically said, based on the qira'ah malakaini, that this is basically the shaitan giving him a promise that he will basically be like the angels, living eternally and basically not dying until then. The other interpretation basically said, well, in other words, he promised Adam, that is, shaitan promised Adam that he would be malakain, two angels, as basically to know the good and the evil. In other words, it's like you'll be better aware of evil, you'll be better aware of what it contains, and that way you'll have a better understanding. And this is very similar that many times people will think that by studying evil, by studying magic, by studying evil things, or of course, out of curiosity. Many times, out of curiosity, people would go to the bad websites. People would basically hang out with the bad guys, thinking that out of curiosity, wonder what they're talking about. Why are they outcasted in the society? Why not? And then little by little, they would become part of them, thinking that if I may be looking like an outcast, because it's a lot harder to try to be good. It's a lot harder to be, and that's the person in history. There's a person in history. Guess what he wanted? Well, he wanted to be known for something. So what did he do? He actually thought, if I were attempting and putting the effort to be good, that's a lot of effort. So why don't I get mentioned in history by doing something extraordinary, something very different? So what did he go do? He urinated in the well of Zamzam. He thought, well, here we go. At least I'll be mentioned in history as the person that urinated in the well of Zamzam. And that's what he did. He urinated in the well of Zamzam. And that's one thing is that many times Shaitan will basically seduce people to thinking that at least be mentioned, even if you are mentioned as the joker of the class, or probably the one that is the bully, or the one that is basically the outcast in class, becomes a problematic. It becomes a very big problem. And certainly Shaitan was seducing Adam with the same way, perhaps, and telling him that he will basically have a bigger vision in knowing good and evil. Perhaps that's the inference in understanding إلا أن تكون ملكين. Perhaps this is the inference. Other scholars, they actually based it on a different qira'ah. Here's, of course, we're basically commenting on this portion of the ayah, which is right here, the word malakain. Other scholars actually said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in a number of different ayat, the inference, basically to understand why did he say malakaini, they said إلا أن تكون ملكين ولا أقول إني ملك ولا الملائكة المقربون. That is basically to say that it is to say that they're extraordinary, they're different, and Shaitan was promising them that they will be basically different, that they will basically be at an upper level than just humans. I don't know how, I don't know how Iblis thought that that would be a good interpretation to doing the wrong thing, but some scholars actually said that that was the inference because the angels, Adam definitely knew that they appeared different. They appeared basically of having extraordinary features as wings or perhaps abilities that humans do not have. So perhaps maybe Iblis marketed that this tree will be something that will give him these extraordinary features, just like the angels. Eh, Maybe that is, an interpretation that maybe that's what Adam understood. Kind of like today, where, hey, if you fill up this, and if you downsize this, and if you add onto this, and if you shape this, you will appear like this model. You will appear this. So, there's a certain standard, but there was no other standard that Adam can compare himself to but the Malaika, because there was no one else. So was Iblis using the model of Malaika to tell him that if you were to eat from that tree, you're going to become like that model of Malaika, to having these extraordinary features, extraordinary powers? Is that what it is? This is a possibility. Is this the inference, perhaps? Maybe this is what some scholars said. There is yet another scholar that basically said, well, there's no evidence in that to actually say that he promised them to be somehow extraordinary, because, anyways, it makes no sense to go eat and think that you will become like an angel, because angels do not eat or drink. So that's Ibn Furak, and that's what he said. He said it makes no sense to actually make that interpretation that Iblis was giving the inference that if you were to eat from the tree, that somehow you become like an angel in your powers, because they don't eat or drink. But I would say it is still possible. It is still possible to say that if you eat from this tree, to give them the promise that this is one way to help you attain and develop such qualities, perhaps. I mean, it, that's probably the way that the way that he probably wanted to give him that promise in. Who knows? Allahu alam. Okay, but certainly Ibn Abbas, he did the qira'ah malikaini. So Malik is basically a king. But here's one thing. Some scholars actually said that this qira'ah is not necessarily a qira'ah that was famous. At the end is that Malik is another qira'ah, or Malikaini is to mean that you will be kings. So how did he promise him that he'll be a king by eating from the tree? Promise him that it contains what what you are basically needing to be in power. It contains what the secret to your authority, the secret to you being in power, and basically that's the same. That's also studying the psychology of Adam. Studying the psychology of Adam, what is he looking for? Other scholars, they actually said it makes no sense to say that he was promising him to be the king because there were no kings at the time. So that model of being a king or being in power was not making sense because, according to some scholars, they said it doesn't make sense because he never had encountered such a system of governance, such a system of power, anyways. The system of monarchy and being a king that developed later when people basically had different statuses, people had different powers, people had basically wanted to basically control certain things, but he was already in control of everything. So in other words, he was already the king. So why is he promising him to be the king? That was one objection to some of the scholars' objection, basically to not only that qira'ah but to that interpretation as well. All right. And the evidence that the scholars actually said it was a promise of Malikaini, and not just Malakaini. They said, well, that's the same thing when you could see هل أدلك على شجرة الخلد وملك لا يبلى. Said, here's our evidence. The evidence says وملك. What is الملك? الملك is a type of ownership, and mulk and ملكين or malikaini. All right. So here we go. They said it's just like mulk. Mulk actually means ownership. Mulk actually means authority. Mulk actually means you're basically having a certain power, a certain control over something. So it doesn't have to be monarchy. In other words, a melik to actually mean like a monarchy system or a kingdom or etc. But it can basically mean وَمُلْكٍ لَا يَبْلَى, to actually mean that this would be something that he would have, let's say, an expansive type of control, an expansive type of authority. So this, I personally think it basically does have a lot of support by looking at وَمُلْكٍ لَا يَبْلَى. All right. And certainly you can see Al-Qurtubi, look at the humble Qurtubi right there. And he basically said, وَمُلْكًا لَا يَبْلَى, even though he quoted here Abu Ubaid that وَمُلْكًا لَا يَبْلَى, it actually has a good point, but then he said, وَلَكِنَّ النَّاسَ عَلَى تَرْكِهَا فَلِهَذَا تَرَكْنَاهَا. Look at the adab. Like he's not convinced that this is not necessarily a bad interpretation, but he said most people did not accept it as a good interpretation, so I just left it. That's al-Qurtubi. It's like, I'm not sure I disagree with so Al-Qurtubi is basically saying, I agree with وَمُلْكًا لَا يَبْلَى as a good argument, as a good evidence that إِلَّا أَن تَكُونَ مَلِكَيْنِ or مَلْكَيْنِ, but most people didn't accept that interpretation, so I just left it. And this is adab. This is adab. You don't always have to stand out with your interpretation, even if you may be perhaps maybe agreeing with a certain argument, even if you perhaps maybe consider a certain argument to be right. Sometimes it's okay to let go of a certain argument, even if you had seen perhaps a good or some good evidence or some good support for that interpretation, but you still let go, just respecting the masses. And I guess respecting the masses is part of the deen unless it goes against the religion. Okay? Because if you are respecting the masses and giving up on your principle, then you've got a problem. Then you put these people to basically be your area of God. And that's contradictory to La ilaha illallah. Keep that one in mind. But if something is not contradicting La ilaha illallah, but you're just tolerating and respecting people's choices, even though you disagree with the argument, that's part of adab. That's part of adab. That's part of showing people that you are willing to embrace their choice and their choices and their choice of preference, even if that isn't necessarily yours. This is adab. And I would say, especially in a marriage relationship, كسب القلوب أولى من كسب المواقف. Winning the heart is more important than winning the argument. Because the second that you insist on winning the argument, what you will end up doing is that you will be losing supporters, you will be losing your own people. Win your own people, even if that argument is not necessarily what you are supporting, but with time, just know that you don't contain all the data. Just be humble. Winning the argument may sometimes mean that you are losing people. You don't want to lose people, especially if that meant this is your husband or this is your wife. Yes, even if that was your wife. Sometimes, if it's not that serious, sometimes, yes, give in and win the heart. More importantly, it's more important than winning the argument. Okay, let's continue right there. Malikaini. So some scholars actually said Malikaini is a qira'a shadha. Let me just comment on the word qira'a shadha. So the word qira'a shadha, the word shadha actually means an aberration. So when you say an aberration, are you talking about that certain qira'at are basically wrong, erroneous, aberration? It was a mistake. What does that even mean? So there are certain qira'at that had basically been traced to having a group of people hear it from the Prophet ﷺ and basically pass it on to another group of people. And that is what is called mutawatir. The word mutawatir is basically describing that it basically has a group of chain of narrations or groups of chain of narrations to be exact. Okay, groups of chain of narrations going and heading all the way to the Prophet ﷺ. That's what it means to basically say rawahu jam'un an jam'un an jam' to the Prophet ﷺ يستحيل تواطؤهم عن الكذب عادة, that it would be impossible for all these groups of people and the other groups of people and the other group, it's impossible for them to somehow join and support each other to creating or basically making up a lie. Okay, so that's what it means. So with qira'ah shadha, that would basically mean we don't have such a chain of narration where it's a group and a group and a group and a group, they going and tracing all the way back to the Prophet ﷺ. We basically have some qira'ah, but we don't actually have those strong chain of narrations as the other seven qira'at that basically did have a strong chain of narration. Okay, now here's one thing. Of course, not everyone called it a qira'ah shadha because other scholars, they actually said we actually do have a chain of narration for that. Oh, let's see. Let's continue right there. وَقَاسَمَهُمَا إِنِّي لَكُمَا لَمِنَ النَّاصِحِينَ. What did Iblis then later do? Well, in the beginning, فَوَسْوَسَ, let's look at it. We're going to go back to those ayat to actually see what happened and how he played the game and how he studied their psychology. Number one, it started out, فَوَسْوَسَ لَهُمَا الشَّيْطَانِ. It started out with shaitan basically doing, let's call it a subtle, S-U-B-T-L-E, a subtle whisper. That was the beginning. It was a subtle whisper. And with this subtle whisper is basically the beginning of that communication between Shaitan and basically Adam and Hawa. And then he basically did get a listening ear. what happened after that listening ear? Well, لِيُبْدِي لَهُمَا مَا وُرِيَ عَنْهُمَا مِنْ سَوْآتِهِمَا. The first thing that happened with that listening ear is basically once they once they started listening to him, then of course they started what happened is they basically had the covering, and some scholars actually said it is like a shell that was covering their awra, that was covering their awra or their private parts. That's what some scholars described it as. It is actually based on non-authentic ahadith that it was like a dhufr. The best translation that I could give, dhufr is not necessarily as a nail per se, but it could also mean shell. Okay? It could also mean shell. All right. So لِيُبْدِيَ لَهُمَا مَا وُرِيَ عَنْهُمَا مِنْ سَوْآتِهِمَا is to tell us that in the beginning, the first type of waswasa that shaitan practiced, what actually resulted into the uncovering. So what does that basically, the beginning, or was that the result? Was that the goal that shaitan was getting to? So that's why we went in details, لِيُبْدِيَ, and we said that the lamb was basically his main goal. What did shaitan want to do? He wanted to make it into steps. The first step for waswasa was to get that listening ear. What was his goal? His goal was to actually uncover their private parts, to reveal that area, to remove the modesty. And that's the area of ird. Once you get into the field of ird, then you will find yourself going into that getting dragged into the area of all the different illicit behaviors. Think of it as a dominoes, exactly like a dominoes. It goes one piece after another. That's the same thing. When you look at, for example, a game, what do? Well, you will say, expect, of course, if they're going to be stealing, they're going to be, of course, committing zina. They're going to be perhaps even lying. They could be killing. They could be all of the different bad things will basically go as a dominoes. It's not that they're just aimed at one thing, but it becomes a number of different things. It becomes a whole world. And the most important area that he can drag Adam and Hawa into is by basically aiming at their ird, taking out the modesty. Because modesty is one of those key things to helping us learn how to control our drives. When you control their drive, which is really similar to animal drives, which is part of your reproduction. Once you learn how to control that, that's when you will be capable of controlling many other drives. Perhaps the weakest drive is basically the drive for money, even though it is basically a strong drive. How do we know those drives and those strong drives? Number one, the strongest drive is deen. The second drive is your life, your drive to stay alive, your drive to protect your life. That's the second strongest instinct that you basically have. The third one is mind. It basically controls what you think. All of these different things. That's the mind. Ird, part of you is basically wanting to reproduce. That's ird. Indil mal, money. You're trying to basically say different ways to get money because you basically would say that money is the way to help me find sustained living, to help me find authority, to help me find those different things. It becomes money. And then, of course, certainly what Iblis wanted to do, and that's liyubdiya lahuma, that lam is basically the explanatory, or at least to give me the reasoning of what he was aiming at. وقال ما نهاكما ربكما عن هذه الشجرة إلا أن تكونا ملكين. So ما نهاكما ربكما عن هذه الشجرة إلا أن تكونا ملكين. So that was that narrative that he wanted to do. But did they yet believe him? They didn't yet believe him. They kind of hesitated. You can, exactly like what Tahir ibn Ashur had said. Tahir ibn Ashur said that they were hesitant when they heard him basically promising that. They were hesitant. They did give a listening ear, but did they yet fully believe? Did they implement anything yet? No. But Iblis was capable of seeing that I just need to give some affirmation to the promise because they're not yet believing him. But he can see that they're doubting. Maybe that's, oh, and that's the beginning of fitna. The beginning of fitna is when you start giving a listening ear. Whether you're watching these reels or whether you're listening to these people or whether you're basically hanging out with these people, it starts out, even if you do not behave in their behavior yet, just by surrounding yourself with these people. Remember, al-arwahu junudun mujannada. Your soul, your nafs, based on the people that you hang out with, is basically going to be shaped by these people. If you want to reshape your heart, you want to reshape your nafs, you have to force yourself to be in the midst of the other groups that you would like your heart to be shaped with. We're not just talking about shaping it into deen, but even in dunya. You want to basically be a person that is successful, good grades. Guess what? By hanging out with people that are considered the ones to have good grades, you would raise your chances of having better grades by 35%. Well, that's the same thing. You hang out with the salihin, you increase your chances of being one of the salihin. Same thing by 35% just by hanging out with them, even if you're probably not doing with what they're doing. You're probably not memorizing Quran like them. You're probably not listening to what they're listening to and all of that. You're probably not doing the same thing, but you increase your chances of becoming one of them and probably even getting the malaika to see that. Remember the hadith when the Prophet ﷺ had said that the malaika would actually come in search of circles that are basically learning the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or learning Islam basically. And then the malaika would basically come across a halaqa. And then what happens? Well, this person is not necessarily part of the group, but the malaika will go to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and say, well, we found this class, we found this halaqa, this is what they were doing. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will say, well, be a witness that I will forgive them. In other words, their sins will be forgiven, and that's the blessing for that halaqah and being part of it. But they will say, but there's this person that is basically a sinner that is amongst them. And the Prophet ﷺ would say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would say, will start and include him basically within this rahmah or this mercy or this forgiveness. Even though, was he actually part of them? Well, he was just sitting with them, but he wasn't always necessarily with them. In other words, he wasn't on the same page that everybody else was on, but he was with them at least in that number. And this is extremely important. The beginning of change actually starts within by you choosing to change the group of people you hang out with. And that's the beginning of change. You determine to basically decide that you want to be with someone else. And certainly, ما نهاكما ربكما عن هذه الشجرة إلا أن تكونا ملكين أو تكونا من الخالدين. What did Iblis want to promise? He basically wanted to promise him that, hey, you will be angels and you will live eternally. And then he said, قَاسَمَهُمَا. Okay, now he goes into a different level of affirmation. What did he do with his marketing? He used a different thing. Now he basically used the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and made an oath and swore by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that he was basically honest in what he was saying. But here's what he just swore by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is extremely important to learn that many people will actually come in the image of religion in order to seduce people. Keep that one in mind. Many will come to seduce people presenting it that it was part of the religion. In fact, even if you were to look at Fir'aun, what did Fir'aun do? Fir'aun came in the same direction as that. What did he say? Basically presented himself as a person of principle. And what did he say? إني أخاف أن يبدل دينكم أو يظهر في الأرض الفساد. Speaking about Musa, I fear that he will change your religion or he might spread corruption in our civilization that we had worked basically hard on making. Who's that? Well, that's the Pharaoh himself. The person that was killing the children and killing the women and basically killing the men and all of that. And now he's coming to present himself as the person of similar to today, right? The people that are killing and committing genocides are presenting themselves as the ones to basically be civilized and the ones to support humanity and the ones to support human rights and all of that. So it's exactly the same thing. Fir'aun was presenting himself that he was basically in favor of human rights and justice, and that he was afraid that Musa was going to be the terrorist. It's like, look who's speaking. Look who's talking. All right. And that's the same thing, is that presenting himself as a person of faith. A lot of the imposters, they actually come in that image, in the image of, yes, this is a raqi, or this is a shaykh, when in reality, they have nothing to do with Islamic knowledge. But they'll present themselves as sheikh. And this is why one of the main reasons to learn Islam is to know the difference between ilm and all of those interpretations that really have nothing to do with Islamic foundation. A lot of those motivational speakers that would seem like they're presenting Islam online, social media, or even on pulpits, etc. You got to be really careful. Got to be really careful. And you want people to present to you the books to let you see those evidences. Because especially right now with AI and especially with all of that, anybody can misquote and anybody can take words out of context and present it as if it was ilm. وَقَاسَمَهُمَا إِنِّي لَكُمَا لَمِنَ النَّاصِحِينَ. He promised them using faith. He presented himself as a person that was swearing by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and certainly, it was said that Adam alayhi salam, he never thought that anybody would actually make an oath by lying. He never thought that anybody would do that. So when he said, فَدَلَّاهُمَا بِغُرُورٍ. So what did he do? دَلَّاهُمَا بِغُرُورٍ. He basically had what is the word dallahuma? Dalla, or dalala, basically means to guide someone to something, to basically help you into a certain thing. Okay, so that's dalla, to guide you into something. But here, فَدَلَّاهُمَا بِغُرُورٍ is to tell us that both actually took that ghurur. What is the al-ghurur? Al-ghurur is basically to deceive someone. Al-ghurur is to deceive. Al-ghurur could also be in arrogance. So what did he do? فَدَلَّاهُمَا بِغُرُورٍ. It can mean that Iblis, when he basically had made that oath, he was so proud of himself with that arrogance. I made it. I did it. That was one interpretation. The second interpretation, فَدَلَّاهُمَا بِغُرُورٍ, that Iblis had basically had manipulated them. That's another meaning for ghurur, manipulated. So he manipulated them and guided them through manipulation, that was their way to getting success, that was their way to getting eternity, that was their way, and by eating from that tree, that is. فلما ذاقا الشجرة بدت لهما سوآتهما وطفقا يخصفان عليهما من ورق الجنة. What was the first thing that happened? The first thing that happened when they had committed the sin is basically whatever was covering their private parts, it basically got revealed. Wait, was that a shell that was there that was guarding their private parts, or what was it? But before I get into that, I wanted to actually comment on a number of different things that were mentioned in right here, Tafsir al-Qurtubi. Let's see. So number one is, let's look into this one. That ghurur, that Iblis basically led them to corruption. Okay, we said that one. And that he basically used the oath to promise them to do what is wrong, basically. And Adam did not think that anybody would make an oath using lying. And he said basically, Zad al-Masir, Tabari basically said this argument, and that فغرهما, meaning that he manipulated them by using some form of waswasa, in which is a different a whisper, basically communication with them. But here's one thing. I want you to look at this one. He said, كان بعض العلماء يقول من خادعنا بالله خدعنا. What does that even mean? من خادعنا بالله خدعنا. Whoever manipulates us by the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they had manipulated us. Is this what it means? I'm going to explain it in just a bit. In another quote, المؤمن غر كريم والفاجر خب لئيم. المؤمن is غر كريم. A believer is غير. What is الغير? غير is basically naive. So unbeliever is supposed to be naive or innocent. What's the proper interpretation? Naive or innocent? And what's the difference? So innocent basically is not aware of how people manipulate and how people play the games of manipulation. That's a believer. Is not necessarily all aware of how people cheat and how people manipulate. They're not aware of they're not aware of all of that. They're kareem. They're basically generous. In other words, when we say kareem, in other words, generous in their qualities, generous in their environment. When we say generous in qualities and environment, in English, that doesn't make sense to actually use, a sentence generous in qualities, but it is more accurate to say honorable. Honorable in their qualities. So they're honorable people, people that are attending the masajid, they are not quite acquainted with the different methods that perhaps thieves in what they do and the different methods that they would use on the streets, or they're not aware of the different types of drugs, they're not aware of the different types of cigarettes and different types of alcohol and they're not aware of that. They're not aware of the, what's in the area of probably, let's just call them bad places. They don't even know those names. They don't even know the difference between this kind of club and that kind of club and whatever it is. They're not aware of it because it isn't something that they're aware of. It isn't something that would concern them. It isn't something that they know of. And therefore, they're ghirrun karim. Well, they're usually innocent and honorable in their akhlaq. They're not aware of those channels of evil. وَالْفَاجِرُ خِبٌّ لَئِيمٌ. And al-Fajr is basically the person that is evil, that had committed. Al-Fajr committed probably, perhaps maybe zina, committed stealing, committed lying, committed all these different things. And this person becomes Fajr. They had trespassed so many boundaries that they had become Fujjar. What is al-Fajr? Fajara actually means to be extreme in the level of trespassing the border or the boundary. So it wasn't just a lie. No, you made a big lie and you managed to rob a bank, for example. Or you managed to, I don't know, you don't make a lie to rob a bank, but let's see. You managed to make a big lie, perhaps to, I don't know, to get away with something that you had done. Okay. Or you managed to perhaps maybe use certain force in order to rob a bank. Maybe that would be making more sense. Okay. And therefore, that would be fajr, exceeded not just a small limit, but exceeded the limit by far. Usually, al-fujur is when you do it in public, when you also do it in front of a big number of people. There's a difference between committing sin in private and committing sin in front of a large number of people because you had exceeded a number of different limits and that you were willing to make it public. You were willing to basically have the audacity to exceed the limit and actually go beyond all the different areas of fear. That's al-fujur. You would be afraid to probably do something and be accountable for it. But then if you trespassed it, you had gotten basically so used to it. That's fujur. Khib. What is al-khib? Khibbun la'im. Khib actually means stupid, dumb. Khibbun, so they're basically dumb to stupid, basically to think that doing the wrong thing is somehow smart. But they're also la'im. What is la'im? La'im is mean. What is mean? Well, when you're talking about mean in this context, you're talking about that they're just self-centered. They don't care about people's boundaries. They don't care if it hurts people. They don't care if it harms anyone. All they want is basically self-interest. All they want to feed is basically their own ego or their own interests. That's a khibbun la'im. إن الكريم إذا تشاء خدعته وترى اللئيم مجربا لا يخدع. That's what Niftaway said. Who's Niftaway? Well, Niftaway is one of the key scholars. You can think of Sibawayh. Yes, there's Niftaway as well. He was one of those key scholars that was basically a scholar in Arabi grammar. He was not Arabi, by the way. He was Farisi. Okay. Let's see. Inna al-Karima, he said that al-Karim, the honorable people, you can certainly manipulate them. But you would see al-La'im, basically these ill-mannered, these mean people, they're so well practiced and so well versed in such areas of manipulation that you can't manipulate these people. You can't manipulate them. They're just so well versed in it. They just know all those methods of gaming that they're really aware of those ways of cheating. But here's one thing. First of all, let me just look into the references for that. Let's look at this one. First of all, من خادعنا بالله خدعنا. And right there, he said, أخرجه الطبري. I'm going to get to seeing, further in references for this one because, to be honest, I did not actually get convinced أخرجه الطبري and just leave it at that. Needed to go further referencing, and that's what I'm going to let you see in just a bit. The second one is المؤمن غر كريم والفاجر خب لئيم. And then he basically said, well, it was narrated by Ahmad Abu Dawud al-Tirmidhi, and it was from the narration of Abu Huraira, basically Ghirrun Kareem, and he basically quotes Ibn al-Athir, basically Nihaya fi Gharib al-Hadith, and it basically said, explaining that what that means, as Ibn al-Athir basically explained. Ibn al-Athir, he has this book, it's almost in 5 volumes, okay? Well, yeah, 5 volumes, 6 volumes. And what he did in this book, it's called النهاية في غريب الحديث, all the words that are very different, and in other words, they're not common words in hadith, he would basically take those words and kind of like doing glossary and like a dictionary type of thing, just for those words that appeared once or twice only, and they're not very common to be seeing them in different hadith. So he just did kind of like a dictionary just for those words that don't appear frequently. So that's what he did in his in Nihaya. Okay, so what did he say? He said, well, al-khib or al-khab here, he wanted to say al-khab, not al-khib, okay, that it is basically that a believer is usually good in their attributes, usually good in their behavior, and therefore, they're not aware of the evil traits that people will do. They're not aware of these evil manipulations and these evil paths. And therefore, they would not even look for them. They wouldn't even look for them. They wouldn't even care to know them because not because they're ignorant about them, but because they have good manners that they don't want to basically go in searching for those things. But at the same time, like I said, we needed to search further and actually see where does that come from? That al-mu'min, let's see right there. I want you to look at this one. So min aqwal salaf, that was Ibn Umar. He was the one that said, Man khada'ana billahi in khada'na lahu. Whoever basically uses Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to manipulate us in, we will end up getting manipulated. So, in other words, kind of like in the mainstream, at least in Palestine, we would call that person darwish, which is darvish in Turkish, to basically mean the Sufi group that are usually not aware of the different tactics that evil people might be using, and they become easily cheated on or easily manipulated. What is the story? So now we know it was Ibn Umar that said that, but why was it said? That where did he say it in? So a very good website, you could see right there, Durar Saniya, we talked about that, and you could see right there that little thing that pops up right there. It said رواه ابن سعد في الطبقات الكبرى. So unlike the ones that went to that reference for al-Qurtubi, at the bottom in the footnote, they just said رواه الطبري, but then these guys did further studying and they said, well, it was actually narrated by Ibn Sa'd and Abu Nu'aym and Ibn Asakir في تاريخ دمشق. تاريخ دمشق is huge. It is almost in 35 or 40 volumes. It is huge. Ibn Asakir al-Dimashqi is from Dimashq, so just keep that one in mind. Abu Nu'aym al-Asbahani is from Iran, Asfahan, Iran. And Ibn Sa'd, all right? Now, من خدعنا بالله خدعنا له. What is the story? When did he even say that? Well, in order to understand the context, let's see. So, Abdullah ibn Umar, it basically was certainly one of the most important Sahaba. What he did was he set a rule if he would see from the slaves, a good history, appearing like a good dean, that he will basically, put in a new policy or put in a new strategy that if somebody appears in good behavior, good dean, that they'll basically get freed from the slaves. In other words, that's the qualification. The qualification is for you to show good conduct, good behavior, good commitment, and basically that's going to be your pass and will free you. So some of the slaves were pretending to be on good conduct just to get this pass. So some of the other people, they basically said, you do know that a lot of these slaves, they're actually faking religion. They're faking piety, and you end up getting manipulated and believing it. They faked repentance. They faked good conduct. They faked good faith, and you fell for it. And you went and you simply freed them. So Abdullah ibn Umar said this quote then. He said, well, at the end, certainly, if they use Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and they basically faked it using faith, I have basically definitely no option but to basically, well, yes, they are going to be capable of manipulating us that way. But does that mean that we should just fall for it and just say, well, I mean, yeah, maybe, perhaps, etc. Um, maybe, but at the end of the day, At the end of the day, of course, a believer is supposed to be كيس فطن. A believer is supposed to be كيس فطن, smart and aware, smart and aware. Smart and aware, and not somebody that is easily manipulated. But here's one thing I would really want you to see this quote. وهب بن منبه. Let's see what he said. He said, من عرف بالكذب لم يجز صدقه. Look at this one. If somebody was known to lying, then we cannot just believe them if they had a history of being liars. ومن عرف بالصدق اؤتمن على حديثه. And if this person was known to being a person of honesty, then we're going to consider that they're living a pattern of honesty. We're going to believe them. If a same thing, ومن أكثر الغيبة والبغضاء لم يوثق منه بالنصيحة. And if somebody has a history of backbiting and hating on people, then in that situation, you cannot trust them to giving you an advice, because they may actually be influenced by their sentiments towards X or Y and Z, what would actually make a fair advice. ومن عرف بالفجور والخديعة لم يوثق إليه في المحبة. Then whoever is known to basically being a person of transgressing the limits, basically committing haram and committing illicit behavior, and khadi'a, and manipulation or betrayal, then in that situation, you cannot trust their love. If they basically have a history of one, fujur, of trespassing boundaries in deen, or if they were basically manipulators and cheaters or people that basically betrayed, you cannot trust their love. And وَمَنْ انْتَحَلَ فَوْقَ قَدْرِهِ جُحِدَ قَدْرُهُ. And whoever basically embraces some kind of a status that is bigger than the status of what he really is, then in that situation, his own status would not later be regarded. ولا يحسن فيه ما يقبح في غيره. And in that situation, of course, what he might actually think that is fit to basically, yes, hold them in that status. You put yourselves in the wrong thing. You don't deserve that good good compensation because you put yourself in the wrong position. Okay, now one thing I want you to see is that just looking at these, in the end, المكر والخديعة صاحبهما في النار. صاحباهما في النار, sorry. In other words, the Prophet ﷺ basically in this hadith, that if a person manipulates, if a person cheated, what does it mean to cheat or manipulate? To cheat or to manipulate is not to be at the expectations of the other person and what they expected you to be in. I expected you to be honest. I gave you this much money. I expected you to put it in such and such service. I expected you to give it this way. I expected you to do this and this. Then in that situation, if you did not fulfill what was expected of you, then you are a cheater. You had betrayed. And this is what the Prophet ﷺ, صاحباهما في النار. They'll basically be companions. المكر والخديعة, they will be companions to them in hellfire. The other thing that I wanted to actually take you to is, let's see this one. خياركم في الجاهلية خياركم في الإسلام. But let me first take you into this one. The Prophet ﷺ, he basically was asked, من أكرم الناس? What is أكرم الناس? أكرم الناس basically means the most honorable of the people. Who is the most noble person? Who's the best person? And he said, أتقاكم. The best person is basically the one with the best taqwa. Why? Because people will see in them that they're living the principle, and they will be living the principle whether someone is seeing them or whether no one is seeing them, because they know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is seeing them. They live to the principle. The principle, the akhlaq, the manners, they will live them regardless of whether they got caught or not, because they know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is overseeing them. So then they said, well, that's not what we're asking about. We're not asking about that. So the Prophet ﷺ said, oh, فيوسف نبي الله ابن النبي ابن نبي الله ابن نبي الله ابن خليل الله. So the Prophet ﷺ answered, well, this is Yusuf. If you're talking about the most noble person, it would be Yusuf. He's the son of a prophet, the grandson of a prophet, and the great-grandson of basically Ibn Khalilillah, basically Ibrahim alayhi salam. They said, that's not what we're asking you about. So the Prophet ﷺ said, are you asking me فَعَنْ مَعَادِنِ الْعَرَبِ تَسْأَلُونِي? Are you asking about the quality of the Arab, of the people, the Arab, the tribes, the Arabic tribes? And then of course, the Prophet ﷺ knew what they were asking about, but he was presenting to them kind of like a prelude that the most important thing is really taqwa. And if you're talking about the most noble person, well, that's basically that chain of narration of Salihin. Chain of narration of Salihin. But if you're actually asking about something else, ma'adin al-Arab. What is al-ma'dan? Al-ma'dan is supposed to be the element, just gold, silver, steel, copper. That's ma'dan. Okay? There's different solid ma'adin. They're different solids. What is that supposed to say? That there are certain qualities that are within you, within your DNA. So the Prophet ﷺ basically said, are you asking about these elements? Are you talking about the different types of people? And the Prophet ﷺ said, خِيَارُهُمْ فِي الْجَاهِلِيَّةِ خِيَارُهُمْ فِي الْإِسْلَامِ إِذَا فَقُهُوا or إِذَا فَقِهُوا. Two different narrations. خِيَارُهُمْ فِي الْجَاهِلِيَّةِ. The best ones that had a history of jahiliyyah, a history where they were probably the bullies in class. They have a history of that. But then, when they repent, they'll be the ones to lead in good. خِيَارُهُمْ فِي الْجَاهِلِيَّةِ خِيَارٌ فِي الْإِسْلَامِ. During jahiliyyah, they went wrong. But they had a history of being the ones in leadership. They had a history. When you look at Jahiliyyah, we're talking about the pre-prophetic times. They had a history of the Jahiliyyah during the pre-prophetic era, pre-Islamic era, and then later on, so before that, they were basically the chieftains. They were the ones in basically in leadership, etc. And then when they had become Muslim, they'll basically continue on that path of leadership. But then he said one thing that is crucial, to basically give them the ability to, let's call it, transfer this noble hierarchy type of leadership or type of nobility during Jahiliyyah to when they had become Muslim, how they will maintain that madan, how they will maintain that quality. When does this happen? إذا فقهوا. If they learned Islam. If they did not have that knowledge in the deen, then they will not maintain that nobility. In other words, what will happen? The qualities that had driven them to being in those positions could be self-centricity, could be just knowing how to manipulate the masses, etc. Then it will be the self-centricity. Even if they were to become Muslim, they will be the same material. They're evil, even if they had said La ilaha illallah. But what will only be as shifting them to being the noble ones is only if they learned Islam. The word faqh is not necessarily knowing the Islamic rulings, but it is learning Islam. If they learn Islam, then they will learn their borders, then they will learn their boundaries. They will know what it means to trespass a limit. They will know what it means to preserve the deen, to preserve people's lives, to preserve their life, to preserve their aql, to preserve ird, to preserve their chastity and other people's chastity, and to preserve people's property and people's wealth. They will know those borders. But if they don't know those borders, then they will maintain the same type of jahiliyyah that they basically had been living in even when they become Muslim. So, in other words, there are certain things in order for you to basically grow with that. Basically, خياركم في الجاهلية خيارهم في الجاهلية خيارهم في الإسلام إذا فقهوا. I want to take you right there. This is, it's so it's so important to actually see the reference. He said it was narrated by al-Bukhari. This is the number of hadith, and basically Sahih Muslim with this number of hadith. So just seeing that one is extremely important. The other hadith, or was it, hold on, let me see the other reference, is that al-mu'min ghirrun kareem wal-fajiru khibbun la'im. We talked about that one. Okay, so let's continue with Tafseer al-Qurtubi, فَدَلَّاهُمَا بِغُرُورٍ. If there are any questions about what I was talking about, go ahead. I can probably just sense that some people wanted to say something before we go past this. No one? Okay, let's continue then with Tafsir al-Qurtubi. So with Tafsir al-Qurtubi, فَدَلَّاهُمَا. This actually goes to the same root as adla dalwa, adla dalwa when in Surah Yusuf, that they basically had let their dalu, which basically is a bucket, okay, in order to fetch the water in that abandoned well. So they basically throw their bucket with, of course, the rope in it, and then in order to fetch water, but then a child basically appears in that bucket, and which was not expected. All right, how did this child go in there? Who put him in there? Well, they didn't have all the information, zero information, but it was Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam. So that's what adla or idda'il fadallahuma, that actually goes to the same root right there. So when you look at as iddalla, Idella is basically to show onto something, to guide towards something. Whether you're doing, whether you're guiding towards good or whether you're guiding towards evil, at the end of the day, if you're talking about guiding towards evil, leading people probably to speaking bad words or probably using bad substances or doing any of these things, well, that's having jur'a ala al-masiyah. That's how it starts. It starts it starts by the person basically having the audacity. It starts with learning that it's okay to break these rules. You'll get away with it. It starts with breaking all the fears. The first fear is I'm not afraid of my parents. I'm not afraid of the teacher. I'm not afraid of the policy. I'm not afraid of the police. I'm not afraid of this. And then it becomes to actually tear down every single fear. And this leads to all these crimes. You will see and of course it will be presented as courage, but it's not courage. It's not courage. It's actually lack of discipline. It is actually lack of iman in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He'll, even if you had trespassed. So in other words, they will not be disciplined with their parents once they're they will not be disciplined with their parents once they are probably old enough and their parents are weaker. That's basically lacking akhlaq. Because al-khuluq is when you actually live the discipline regardless of being held accountable or not. That's al-akhlaq. Al-akhlaq is in number one is fearing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Not fearing. Yeah, maybe. You can get away with it in class or probably get away with it. Maybe the other people can't defend themselves, but that's not akhlaq. That's shaitan. That's shaitan. A person of khuluq, a person of mannerisms, is the person that lives up to the manner, up to the principle, even if that meant their own life was put at stake. That's true shaja'a. That's courage. Courage is when you're able to live the manner, even if your life was put at stake. That's courage. That's bravery. When to you, principle is the highest thing that you want to live up to, is the highest thing that you want to live up to, no matter what the price meant. That's khuluq. That's the highest level of akhlaq. But a person that will live the akhlaq only because they're afraid of the consequence, oh, that's not the highest level of akhlaq. But is it part of akhlaq? Sure, it is part of akhlaq. But discipline and tazkiyah, the highest level, think of it as different levels. The highest level is that you would live up to the akhlaq, you respect your parent, even when they had become very old and very weak to probably yell at you or probably do something, but you live up to those akhlaq, even when you had become basically the macho man and the big muscle man and probably the one with the money and probably the one with the strength, and they had become so weak. But you will live up to the akhlaq regardless. You will live up to the akhlaq regardless. It's not in fear of what they might basically punish me with or punish me because they can't even punish me anymore. But you live up to the akhlaq. Why? Because you recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to be the one to hold you accountable. And that's the same thing. We're not just talking about parents here. We're talking about same thing when we're talking about society. You're not afraid of the society and what they might comment on the way you dress or what they might comment on why you did X, Y, Z, because you take your definition of akhlaq and your nobility from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not from the society. You take it from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you don't really care. You don't really care about the society and how they would, one, perhaps label you or perhaps give you privileges, because to you, dunya privileges is not what you're looking for. You're looking for akhirah privileges. You're looking for Jannah. So you will live up to Jannah even if dunya did not give you basically the compliment or give you the expected compensation for it, because you don't seek it in this dunya, you seek it in the akhirah. And don't expect that if you probably practice deen that, yes, I'm supposed to be living a happy life. Why are things going differently? No, that's jihad. That's the jihad. Don't expect that everything is necessarily going to go as you might expect. You live up to the principle. You live up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and live up to it despite all the different challenges that may be basically coming at you out there. And the most important discipline, the most important tazkiyah is the tazkiyah within. The tazkiyah within is the highest level of tazkiyah. What is the tazkiyah within? That you live up to the principle, even when, that's the highest level, even when you're probably going to face consequences. If perhaps maybe at one point in Tunisia, if you wore hijab, you might actually get prisoned. Same thing in Turkey at one point. Same thing in Syria at one point. You wore hijab, you will be basically, notice it's mainly those countries, it's Syria, Turkey, and Tunisia. Those are the countries that embraced extreme secularism. And those were the countries, you're talking about, let's see, Turkey was the Khilafah. If you're talking about Syria, it was the capital of ilm. You're talking about Tunisia, you're talking about a second capital of ilm with the Zaytuna. And certainly, when you look at those women, and by the way, that was the case also in Somalia at one point, 1989, not too long ago, right? And that was the case. Women, for wearing hijabs, they were actually put in uh, in cells and dungeons and all of these different areas to basically consider it as correctional institutions. All right. And some of them were actually killed. Anyhow, so this is the highest level. If you are being targeted for basically practicing the deen, but then you insist to live the deen, even when you are basically probably risking your life or risking your wealth or risking perhaps maybe your children, but you're living up to that to the principle regardless, then that's the highest level. The second highest level is basically if a person were to live up to the deen, to the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even when they are capable of trespassing them. Even when they're capable of trespassing them, they would live up to them. What do you mean if they're capable of trespassing them? Well, they can probably get online and their parents, they will get away with it. No one can see what they're doing. And they can delete all the history, delete all the, the different things that would prove or would basically let others see what they're doing, but they managed to do it. Okay. But this person, regardless of my parents being capable of, or people being capable of knowing the history of all of that, I'll live up to the principle because I know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is seeing me. I know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is seeing me. That's a person of nobility. Number 3 is a third stage, consider it. Third stage is basically a person living up to the principle in fear of certain consequences. Fear of people knowing what they had done, or in fear of getting imprisoned, or in fear of their parents basically punishing them, or school punishing them, etc. They're afraid of that. At least they live up to the principle. Oh, that's third stage. And certainly the lowest stage is basically the person that probably trespassed one area, but is yet afraid to go to stage 2. Stage 2, maybe they, I don't know, stole a candy bar and then they still yet they're afraid to steal and rob a bank. But once they get out of that, and they start basically learning those paths, then shaitan will drag them further and further, lower and lower and lower. So that's why our key tarbiyah in tazkiyah, our key tarbiyah and tazkiyah is basically to teach the highest level, how to have taqwa. Taqwa is to have Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically be the one that you recognize is overseeing every single principle, whether you were committed to it or not, because this is a shaja'a. A shaja'a in courage is to live up to the principle even when you may lose certain privileges in this dunya. Just a couple pieces right there. So الجرأة أي جرأهما على المعصية فخرجا من الجنة. So what did he do? So دلاهما بغرور. He basically had done this جرأة على المعصية. What is الجرأة? It starts out, sin starts out by getting into that, let's say a person getting accustomed and basically taking it as a pattern. In their teenage, they probably took a certain pattern of going the wrong way. doing this, doing that. And then once they grow further, then they continue on that path, little by little, continuing on that path. And if they continue on this path, then the trajectory, in other words, the ending of where this will take them, is definitely going to be but in further and further of loss, where they will become working. And I must admit, one of those things that I had really learned a lot is working in prisons and going to prisons. That lifestyle, all of them, not a single one said otherwise, but all of the ones that I had met in prison, they all said it was a friend that basically led them to the wrong path. All of them, they agreed on the same thing. So in order to grow in your deen, the first thing you want to be selective in is, who do you take as a friend? Who do you take as a companion? Who do you take as a person that you will find as a role model? If you're not selective in that, you're going to be finding yourself basically dragged exactly like the same way as Iblis, dragged further and further down, and started out with فَدَلَّاهُمَا بِغُرُورٍ. Started out with manipulating them, that it'll make you basically at this level. It'll make you this and this and this, when in reality, he was just guiding them to nothing but manipulation, to nothing but a mirage, to nothing but just some form of fascination that is empty of what it contains. That's ghurur. Fascination that is empty of what was promised. It is complete emptiness. فَلَمَّا ذَاقَ الشَّجَرَةَ بَدَتْ لَهُمَا سَوْآتُهُمَا. When they ate from the tree, the first thing that appeared was basically their private parts. Why? Because once the private parts appear, once people go that low to speaking about arad, to speaking about sexual things and illicit things, then that's going to lead them to further and further down to being controlled by Iblis. And not unless they stop it, and not unless they take a firm grip over their nafs and a firm determination to stay away from such types of people, will they ever change. The change starts, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِقَوْمٍ حَتَّى يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِأَنفُسِهِمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not change the situation, the status, whatever you are going through, unless you change from within. You start to making the determination from within that I do not want this path. I want to take a different path. I will stop right here. And inshallah, we will continue tomorrow. فَلَمَّا ذَاقَ الشَّجَرَةَ بَدَتْ لَهُمَا سَوْآتُهُمَا وَطَفِقَا يَخْصِفَانِ عَلَيْهِمَا مِنْ وَرَقِ الْجَنَّةِ. Inshallah, we'll continue that tomorrow. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, inshallah. You can go ahead, unmute yourselves, inshallah. And inshallah, we'll be answering. No one has any questions. Everybody wants to go sleep. Okay, that's okay.